All right, we're now moving on to section 2 of our online lecture addressing sexuality in the context of close relationships. For this first slide, what I want to do is just provide you with some prevalence data regarding premarital sexual activity in the United States. I first want to tell you where this data is coming from. So the findings that I'm going to be talking to you about in this section of the lecture are based on a large-scale study that began in 2002, the Health Survey, where they surveyed close to 13,000 Americans ages 15 to 44. The survey was representative in terms of ethnicity and social class. It took place across the United States. Many of the questions were given on computers, and so participants were able to enter their answers on a computer without having to tell their answer directly to an interviewer. Some other sources of the data that I'm going to be presenting to you are from the National Survey of Family Growth, the Center for Disease Control, the Guttmacher Institute, the National Center for Health Statistics, and the National Health and Social Life Survey. Okay, so across a variety of data sources, we are able to obtain information about what the average age at first intercourse currently is in the United States. And across a variety of these sources, what we see is that the average age for first intercourse is approximately 17.7 years old. 17.7 years old for first sexual intercourse. 17.7 years old. So somewhere between the age of 17 and 18 is what we see most Americans reporting for the first time that they had sexual intercourse. First sexual intercourse was premarital or outside of marriage for 83% of the individuals reporting. And this is a consistent finding across a variety of data sources. So you see that about 83% of first sexual encounters are premarital. They're occurring outside of a marital relationship in the United States. The majority of married young adults, and that's right around 67%, and so we use the terminology for the majority. The majority of married young adults have had sexual intercourse with someone other than their spouse. So across these studies, we see that the majority of married American young adults have had sex with someone other than their spouse. Approximately 11% of Americans report remaining abstinent until they got married. Approximately 11% remain abstinent until marriage. And if you look specifically at individuals who have married and they're reporting retrospectively on their sexual behavior, what we've learned is that about 22% of them report that they had sexual intercourse only with the person that they eventually married. So about 22% of these individuals who eventually did get married report that they did have sex outside of marriage, but only with the person that they eventually married. All right, now we're going to begin our discussion of sex and sexual behavior within marriage. The findings that I'm going to talk about for this slide are specific to a study, a very large-scale study actually, that was conducted out of the University of Chicago, in which researchers conducted face-to-face interviews with about 3,400 people who were diverse in terms of ethnicity and social class. The findings that I'm presenting to you also coincide with results that are found in other large national studies. So let's look at the first bullet point, sexual frequency for married couples over the life course. So if you look at all married couples together and you don't break it out by age group or where they are in the life course, you see a pattern where about 40% of married couples, regardless of their age or how many kids they have, etc., about 40% of married couples report that they have sex about twice a week. 40% 98% report sex twice a week. Now, we do know when we break this out by age or life course period that a couple's sexual activity often decreases with their years married. So, although married people still tend to have more sex than their single counterparts, so individuals who might be dating but not living together, we do know that sexual frequency decreases over time for married couples. So let's break out this sample into the different age groups or the different life course periods. So what you see is that newly married couples' sexual frequency averages about 3 times a week. So if you're looking at newlyweds, they're averaging sexual intercourse or some form of sexual activity with one another about 3 times a week. Later in marriage, if you break it down to the years 2 through 10 for married individuals, people who are married 2 to 10 years, they average about 1 to 2 times per week. And then if you break it out even further, break the sample down even further, you see that sexual frequency declines with each subsequent number of years married. Now, it's important to note if you consider marital transition, so individuals who might go through a marital transition where they were married and then they're separated or divorced and then they remarry, we do see an uptick in sexual frequency for remarriage regarding marital sex. So when someone remarries, you see similar patterns to what they might have had in a first marriage as a newlywed. Now, what about sexual activity among elderly married people? Those over 65 in this particular study reported having sex less than once per week. So individuals who are 65 and older reported having sex less than once per week. However, only 1 in 10 of the individuals over 65 reported having completely abstained in the past year. So individuals over 65 reported having sex less than once per week, but only 1 in 10 claimed to have completely abstained in the past year. So that basically means that 90% of the elderly married participants in the study were sexually active, although they average less than once per week when they had to estimate across the year. So what types of sexual activity are married couples engaging in? 95% of the respondents in this study reported that they had had vaginal intercourse when having sex. 95% of the respondents reported that they had had vaginal intercourse when having sex. Although a majority of the respondents reported that they had engaged in oral sex at some point in their marriage, less than 24% reported having engaged in oral sex in their most recent sexual encounter. So the majority of married couples did report having engaged in oral sex at some point in their marriage. However, only 24% reported having engaged in oral sex in their most recent sexual encounter. Anal sex was even less common. Less than 10% of married men and women reported having ever had anal sex. So less than 10% of married men and women reported ever having had anal sex, and only 1 to 2% engaged in it during their most recent sex act. It was actually right between 1 and 2%. Between 1 and 2% of married men and women reported engaging in anal sex during their most recent sex act. Oral and anal sex were more common in this sample among those individuals with higher levels of education, and also more common for white respondents than respondents of other ethnicities. So oral and anal sex were more common among individuals who are more highly educated and also individuals who are white. What about sexual satisfaction? How satisfied are married couples with their sexual activity? And here I'm pulling from some larger national data sets beyond this University of Chicago study. Across these large national data sets, so you're representing Americans in general who are married, they found that 88% of the married individuals were either extremely or very physically pleased with their sexual relationship. So 88% of American married individuals report either being extremely or very physically pleased with their sexual relationship in their marriage. What's interesting in these large national data sets is that we find that sexual satisfaction appears steady over time and doesn't have the same decline as sexual frequency. So remember, in the first bullet point, we learned that sexual frequency does drop off with years married. However, sexual satisfaction appears steady over time and doesn't decline as dramatically as sexual frequency. And that is suggesting a level of adjusting to realistic expectations about sexual behavior in marriage. And your book talks about that a little bit. So what about the next bullet point, predictors of sexual satisfaction? What are the factors that appear to be related to how happy people are with their sex lives? We know that frequency drops off, but couples still appear to be relatively satisfied. We have 88% of couples reporting satisfaction. Sexual satisfaction appears to be associated with the quality of sexual communication. So how well husbands and wives communicate to each other about their sex lives. Sexual satisfaction also appears to be associated with sexual self-disclosure. So how capable are husbands and wives in disclosing to their partner what they like and what they don't like about sexual activity? And finally, we also see that sexual satisfaction appears to be associated with equity. And by this, the researchers mean a sense of equity or equality in the bedroom. So we talked previously about gender roles and the idea of stereotyped gender roles about what men and women are like. But we find that when you get inside the bedroom, having a more equal relationship where both men and women feel comfortable initiating, they both feel comfortable expressing themselves sexually, they both feel comfortable disclosing about their wants and needs and desires, they both feel comfortable providing sexual pleasure to one another, that those sort of factors, those equity across these domains appears to be really important for an optimal sexual relationship in marriage. So I'll repeat these very quickly. The predictors of sexual satisfaction from across these studies appear to be the quality of sexual communication, also sexual self-disclosure, so husbands and wives' ability to self-disclose, and equity. Now, not surprisingly, couples who were more satisfied in their marriages, so people who have happier marriages, people who are more satisfied in their marriages, they tend to have sex more frequently than couples who are less satisfied in their marriages or unhappy in their marriages. So let me repeat that. Couples who are more satisfied in their marriage have sex more frequently than couples who are less satisfied in their marriage. So marital quality, the quality of the marital relationship outside of the bedroom, appears to be also a predictor of sexual satisfaction and of sexual frequency. But it also should be noted that drops in sexual frequency do not necessarily mean that a couple is maritally dissatisfied. A drop-off in sexual frequency does not necessarily mean that a couple is sexually dissatisfied. It simply may mean that you just had a baby, or it may mean that couples are experiencing a great deal of work and family stress. It may mean that someone is ill or has a health-related problem. What appears to be more important for married couples than sexual frequency is sexual satisfaction and other feelings about sex. What appears to be more important than sexual frequency is sexual satisfaction and other feelings that couples have about sex. Satisfaction that they might have about the quality and the quantity of sex. So how do we learn about sex or our sexuality or healthy sexual relationships? Researchers and scholars and practitioners argue that the foundations for having a healthy sexual relationship when you're an adult often begin with the experiences and education you receive about your sexuality and sex as you're growing up. So we know that parents are often a source of this information, and I put a question mark here because sometimes they are a great source of the information, and sometimes parents really struggle with how to teach their children about sex. Peers also are a source of information and sometimes misinformation, often misinformation that children gain about sex or sexuality. Schools vary in the types of sex education programs that they offer for kids. And they typically focus on the basic mechanics of our bodies and biology, less so on relational aspects of sexuality. There are books, and very often, you see parents choosing a process with their children where they provide them with a book that might tell them about their bodies or about sexuality and relationships. What I want to do in this class, given our focus on families, parent-child relationships, close relationships, is provide you with some informed guidelines for parents. Parents often struggle with how to talk to their kids about sex, and even if they do feel comfortable and know that they need to address discussions about sex and healthy sexual relationships with their children, they often struggle with knowing how to do this in a developmentally appropriate way, and they have a lot of worries and anxiety about it. So the American Academy of Pediatrics has issued some really useful tips for parents, guidelines for them regarding how to teach their children about sex and sexuality and healthy sexual relationships. Some of these guidelines are very much geared towards a developmental approach. So how might you talk to a very young child, just teaching them the names of their body parts, versus how do you adjust that conversation for a child who's school-aged or a young adolescent? So we want to take some time in class by providing you in this online discussion some very specific guidelines that are specific to the developmental stage that the child is in. And then when we return to our in-class session, we'll go over some more general guidelines that you can provide to parents. And again, these are guidelines that we would provide to parents to help them teach their children about sex and healthy sexuality. And we will begin those guidelines in part 3 of the online lecture.